All right, guys, welcome to the show. Forgive me if I sound tired. I just woke up less than 15 minutes ago, and I wanted to go ahead and jump right into it. So I got a lot of stuff for you today. The most important story that I'm going to lead with is that basically the CIA has terrorist goon squads, and there was just a huge expose in ProPublica about it, and nobody's talking about it. So we're going to dive into the specifics of that. We have Alex Jones melting down over money woes live on air. That's something. I got more Twitter stuff, more Elon Musk stuff, more GOP civil war. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene versus Lauren Boebert, how that's continuing to heat up and get worse and worse. So we'll talk about all that and much, much more. So let's start here. This article that you're seeing on screen right now is in ProPublica. It's called The Night Raids. It's by Lindsay Billing. Okay, this is her name. And it's a really, really long article. I mean, it took me maybe an hour and a half to read this whole thing. I mean, this thing is basically like a small book. Okay? And let me give you... So I want to discuss the article. Let me go to my notes. I'll show you my notes and we'll walk through it, because again, this is stuff, this should be like, you know, news on CNN that they talk about for a week straight, and MSNBC and Fox News and the nightly news, and this should be, you know, front page of the New York Times, front page of the Washington Post, but none of them are going to talk about it, and it's frankly abysmal. So Lindsay Billing is the journalist. She spent years on this piece about basically CIA terrorist squads. Her parents are Pakistani and Afghan, and she was adopted and raised in England. She was basically searching for answers about her own past because her mom was killed in a night raid. Now, for her mom, it had nothing to do with the CIA. I'm not sure if it was like, back when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan and maybe they killed her mom in a night raid, or if it was because of civil war in Afghanistan that, you know, she got killed in a night raid. But she was interested. She wanted to find her roots. She went back to the region. And so she starts the article off by talking about how in 2018, the CIA took 3 helicopters to an Afghan woman's mud hut. This woman's name, excuse me, is Mazala. And the CIA proceeded to murder her 2 sons. They were 28 years old and 20 years old. They murdered her 2 sons in cold blood. And it turns out her sons were farmers. They weren't part of the Taliban. They weren't part of ISIS. They weren't part of Al-Qaeda. They just murdered these 2 farmer kids, basically. Now, this is going to be, as you'll see here, like a recurring thing, that this is what the CIA was doing in Afghanistan for years and years and years. So it was part of a classified war. This is their admission. They admit that it's a classified war, so it's a war within a war. And they call the units that are doing these murders the zero units. And what it is a mix of the CIA and Afghan-trained special forces, who they're paying basically a shitload of money to do what they do. So the numbers are, it would be about like 10 or 12 CIA agents and about 80 Afghan-trained special forces, and they would go on these missions basically every night. As one U.S. Army Ranger said, quote, "You go on night raids, you make more enemies, then you got to go on more night raids for the more enemies you now have to kill." So in other words, they were doing these night raids for years and years and years. And in the process of doing it, they were creating more enemies of the United States because of, you know, that term that we discussed before, which is blowback, which is unintended consequences of, you know, an interventionist foreign policy and of a war. So here's a quote from the piece. This is the journalist speaking. "I cataloged hundreds of night raids by one of the 4 zero-unit squads, which was known in Afghanistan as the O2 unit, eventually identifying at least 452 civilians killed in its raids over 4 years." So she was able to track 107 raids, 452 civilians killed. And she says it's almost certainly an undercount because she was just tracking one of the 4 units, and she was just one person working on this. So, in other words, she probably missed all of the murders done by this one unit, And then you have 3 other units which were also doing the same thing on a regular basis. So CIA terrorist night raids that would capture and kill innocent people. And as you're about to see, we'll get to it in a second, with no accountability. Quote, even the raids that did end in the capture or killing of known militants frequently also involved civilian casualties. Far too often, I found the zero-unit soldiers acting on flawed intelligence and mowed down men, women, and children, some as young as 2, who had no discernible connection to terrorist groups. So this is something that they stress in the article, like, your raids are only as good as your intelligence. And of course the US likes to pretend like, oh, we have like highly guided precision missiles and special forces that are so high trained that they can avoid all civilian casualties. That's all a myth. If the information that you're acting on is effectively bogus, then you're going to be highly trained while you murk civilians. And that's exactly what was happening. Here's another part from the article. This is the quote continued. And the U.S. responsibility for the zero-unit operations is quietly muddied because of a legal carve-out that allows the CIA and any U.S. soldiers lent to the agency for the operations to act without the same oversight as the American military. So in other words, because these are CIA terrorist raids and they're not U.S. military terrorist raids, there's no accountability. There's no oversight. There's no laws enforced. So if they keep killing civilians, they effectively get away with continuing to kill civilians. People impacted included university students and teachers. So these are the people who were getting killed. They were farmers, university students, teachers. Crazy stuff. So they explain in the article that we did this tactic of night raids in Vietnam. And here's a fact that was mind-blowing to me. A 1971 Pentagon study found only 3% of those killed or captured in Vietnam were full or probationary Viet Cong members. In other words, when we did the night raids in Vietnam, 97% of the time, we were killing the wrong people. Wow. So in Afghanistan, the military also did these raids before the CIA did them. And they explain, quote, more than 80% of those captured terrorists were released within weeks because there wasn't supportable evidence that they were insurgents, and the raids seemed counterproductive. As they ramped up, so did the insurgent attacks. This is an incredible fact. So in other words, I think it was when McChrystal took over Afghanistan in 2009. He was the lead general in the war in Afghanistan. They started doing these military night raids. And they would brag about, oh, we captured thousands of terrorists. Well, 80% of the people that they captured, they had to let go because there was no evidence that they were terrorists. And again, with the U.S. military, there's a little bit more oversight of these actions. With the CIA, there's no oversight. And also, as they did more raids, there were more attacks against the U.S. soldiers, again, because what they're doing is getting a lot of innocent people and then leading to a backlash, leading to blowback. So they stress in the article that when Trump comes in and his, neocon bloodthirsty goon squad, they decided to increase the reliance on these CIA raids. So they say Mike Pompeo announced that the CIA was ramping up its zero-unit night raid approach in Afghanistan. Quote, the CIA, to be successful, must be aggressive, vicious, unforgiving, relentless. You pick the word. You get the sense they either don't know that these raids don't work, or they simply don't care. Because they're like, whatever, they're Afghans. Let's just crack some skulls. Quote, when intelligence officers cite multiple sources of intelligence to justify an operation, it doesn't necessarily mean they have confirmatory information. It could simply mean that they have an overhead image of a house and an informant telling them who's inside. So this is their way of stressing in the article, even when they say we have high confidence, that we should do this raid. It's just high confidence based on what some schmuck is telling them, who they trust. But as you guys aren't going to be surprised to learn, a lot of these people who are informants in Afghanistan just have a grudge against other people, or they're involved in their own political whirlwind themselves. Like, you're only as good as your intelligence, and a lot of our intelligence was fucking flawed every step of the way, and we do CIA terrorist night squad raids based on what these people are telling us. Untrustworthy people. So, just crazy stuff. They continue here. 2 Afghan members of the Zero Unit. So, this woman who wrote this article and did all this groundwork, she spoke to 2 Afghan members of the Zero Unit. And it was very hard for her to get an interview with them. Of course, they didn't want anybody talking to them, knowing what they did, etc. But she found a way to gain their trust and get them to open up about what went down. Here's what they say, quote, "They are Americans killing Afghans, and we are Afghans killing Afghans." The guy's name is Basir. "But I know the Americans do not lie awake at night with the guilt I have." So Basir and his friend who also was part of this, night raid squad, they tell a story of, they're trained by the CIA. They're brought on these missions. And there was one time where they were told, hey, in this house, it's a whole bunch of Taliban guys and they're trying to kill you or whatever. And an RPG hit them. And they were given the order from above, from the CIA, okay, open fire, smoke these fuckers out. And so they went ballistic and shot up this entire house. Well, come to find out, the house they shot up had all civilians in it. It was all women. It was all children. They killed a number of innocent people. And they were pissed about that. It turns out the RPG had come from the other direction, and they had bad intelligence, and they shot up flat out the wrong house. And then we learned that when they got back to CIA headquarters, they were told, or to the base, they were told, you have to sign this document, which basically verifies that there were 0 civilian casualties in this raid. And so these guys, even though they're trained killers, even though they're cold-blooded, they have guilt over what they did because they know every step of the way they were lied to. They know they were acting on faulty intelligence. They know that they ended up killing innocent people. So I'm telling you, this article is mind-boggling in its detail. And it's it shouldn't be me telling you about this. It should be Don Lemon or Wolf Blitzer on CNN. It should be fucking Aaron Burnett. It should be Lawrence O'Donnell. It should be Tucker Carlson. It should be all these mainstream, and none of them will do it. None of them will tell you about this. It's fucking obnoxious. It's unbelievable. You have to come to a YouTube show for me to tell you about what's in this super important article that should be headline news everywhere. Quote, "I could find that the Afghan government said it investigated one that was so audacious that it captured the attention of both the current and former Afghan presidents. The night raid killed 4 brothers, including one who was a legal advisor to the Afghan Senate and another who was a lawyer. And then what they did is they put guns over their bodies and lied and said that these people were jihadists." So this is another crazy story. So the Afghan government never really investigated any of these, instances where civilians were murdered. And again, it was happening on like a nightly basis. Okay. Since they're in bed with the Americans, they get paid a shitload. This was back when the government was propped up, just a puppet U.S. government, right? So there'd be all these issues and they'd say, oh yeah, we'll investigate it. They never investigated it because, they're corrupt. Well, they did investigate one instance of this. And it was when, as, I just described here, there's somebody in the Afghan Senate, a legal advisor to somebody in the Afghan Senate was murdered in a CIA raid. A lawyer was murdered in a CIA raid. These are like high-class people in Afghanistan. And then the U.S. and the CIA lied about it. They put guns over them and said, no, these were jihadists and we killed them. Everybody knew they weren't jihadists because they knew them. And so 2 Afghan presidents had to get involved and, say, oh yeah, we'll investigate this and heads are going to roll or whatever. And of course, nothing ever happened. So Daniel Hale, as you guys remember, is in prison for revealing that 90% of Afghans who were killed in airstrikes in the war are, quote, not the intended targets. Well, what I learned in this piece is when children were killed, not just in airstrikes, but when children were killed in these, CIA terrorist raids, they were called TITS or TITS. And that stands for terrorists in training. So they wouldn't count them as like, oops, we killed a civilian. They would count them as like, we got a terrorist. So, again, massive shout out to Lindsay Billing for this article here. Again, it's super long. I highly recommend you read the whole thing. It's going to take you about an hour and a half or so. It took me a very long time. And I took notes as I went through it because I needed to share all this stuff with you. But this is real journalism. And it pains me that she probably spent years of her life on this, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. And then she publishes this thing on ProPublica. And again, nobody in mainstream media is going to take this and run with it. Nobody's going to give it the coverage it deserves because it's long and it's wonky and it's about, innocent Afghans who were fucking murdered by CIA terrorist squads. But, look, that's what I'm here for. That's what my job is, to give you guys the news that you should be getting. And this is definitely news you should be getting. The CIA has terrorist goon squads who murder civilians on a regular basis, and then they lie about it and cover it up. So there's a talking point that you hear all the time whenever somebody brings up the CIA. Oh yeah, they used to do bad things. They used to overthrow governments that were against the United States, but now, hey, they've kind of like grown out of it or whatever. This is the implication of when people use that talking point. The fact of the matter is, that's not remotely true. We know for sure they're still doing fucked up things. And now, because of this expose and all of this detailed information, we know on a regular basis they were massacring civilians in Afghanistan, and they were lying about it. So, these are war criminals. They should be brought to justice. I won't hold my breath for that to happen. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.